Yeah? Okay, any issues that came up from last time? Any questions? I've got one before Judith. When I was doing the bit, just a second. When I was doing this bit before about artifact mediation and dual stimulation, and explaining that how important it was, because this was how the mind was developed historically, culturally, through the shared use of signs and artifacts. But there's something that Russell said meant that I'm really remiss in not introducing you to what Vygotsky called the genetic law of cultural development. And I'll read out how he expresses this law. Every function in the cultural development of the child appears on the stage twice, in two planes. First the social and then the psychological. Okay? So this is how it happens. This is how dual stimulation and the introduction of signs and artifacts into someone's activity to help them solve a problem, that's how it gets into the psychology. It enters first on the social plane. Someone helps you out with something, someone humiliates you in public, someone shows you the way, someone falls in love with you, or whatever happens out there in the world. As a child, for instance, the mother says, do that, son or daughter. And then the next day, the child will be saying, you mustn't touch that, dirty. Right? The child will directly appropriate an action that they've done with somebody else, such as any kind of interaction, and makes it a part of their own mentality. Right? So that's what Vygotsky called the genetic law of cultural development. Now, of course, social interaction, like being told that something is wrong by someone else and then making a habit of not doing it, they're two different things. Obviously, in the process of just entering the psyche, transformations take place, which is a deep question. We need to be aware of that law. So I thought that was remiss of me not to introduce you, and I've added that little bit to the PowerPoint. Now the other thing is that, Judith, you had a question. Can you speak up and tell us again your question?
I had a question from last
week.
If unit and unity is same or different. We talked about that, and because I was thinking in a way, if unit is maybe the combination of two things, it combines two things. It can be a unit of many two things. Recently I have been to a Perezhivanie symposium in Monash. So if I give example, can I give example from Perezhivanie? So to my understanding, Perezhivanie, and what I understand from the presentation there, Perezhivanie is a unit of consciousness, and it is a unit of consciousness, and it combines environment and person. And so I was thinking this with the example Vygotsky mentions about the water molecule, which is a combination of hydrogen and oxygen. The water molecule is a unit of these two things, and it's a unity of these two things, and it's a unit of water. Yeah. So that time I was not so clear what if unit and unity are same or different. So I twisted this as from that example. So when we talk about maybe Perezhivanie, or I work with science concept, science concept formation, and in science concept formation, we see everyday and scientific concepts. So these are two different things, but they are still related. They are contradictory, like hydrogen and oxygen in water molecules, but at the same time, when they have relations. When they combine, they develop the actual concept of a science concept, for example. So, and Perezhivanie, first, if I want to connect concepts like scientific concept development and Perezhivanie, then Perezhivanie is to my understanding a bigger thing, bigger concept, and it can be scientific concept. When scientific concept is developed or developing, this everyday and science concept come together. And at the same time, this is a Perezhivanie, this is an experience of emotions. Maybe in science we have emotions. When we come to a contradictory experience in terms of concept formation, then there is a Perezhivanie happening.
Let's just hold at that point, do not try and respond. Okay. In the first session, we didn't quite get to the end and didn't quite get to deal with this concept of unity. It's very much what we'll do today, so it's not a bad thing to start with it again now. In a way, I really wish that this word hadn't come along, because the word unit and the word unity sound very much the same, and they do in Russian as well, and there's even a case in the authoritative edition of Thinking and Speech where it's mistranslated and put in unity where it should be unit, right? And people get very confused by these statements that something is a unity of this and that, right? And Perezhivanie, which is the first thing up today, is a classic case where this whole idea really confuses people, and it doesn't have to confuse people. It's just a mode of expression. When we say something forms a unity, we just mean that they come together, they unite. Two things make one thing. So the relation of unity is a relationship between two different, usually quite different things. Yeah? Like I've drawn this little guy in a uniform to show how he's both a person and a role. Yeah? He's wearing a uniform to show that he's officially representing some organisation, looks like an army or something, I don't know what, or maybe he's just a tram conductor, whatever he is, and he's also a human being with all the qualities of that. And when when someone takes on it, they're both things, they're sort of united. And I've drawn a little Venn diagram to show, sort of really simply, it's the both A and B. When something is a unity of A and B, it means actually in mathematical terms the intersection. So something has both the properties of A and the properties of B. Right? It doesn't mean A and B. Right? It doesn't mean all of the A's and all of the B's. But it could, with a word like unity, it could mean that. Right? If I say the unity of all the trade unions, you presume I mean all 150 trade unions going and doing something together. But I would, in this sense, be talking about some fellow who went around and joined every one of the unions. It would be a very rare thing, right? So that's what unity means. So if you're talking about H2O, this is Vygotsky in the first chapter of Thinking and Speech takes the water molecule as an example to illustrate the idea of a unit. H2O is a unit of water, because if you take an ocean or a raindrop or a bucket of ice, whatever, formed water comes with its various properties. In each case, it's nothing but millions and millions of H2O molecules. And by understanding that that's all it is, nothing but H2O molecules, then that allows you to actually understand those different phenomena. Right? If, on the other hand, you were to break the water molecule in two and say, well, it's a unity of hydrogen and oxygen, then that in itself doesn't allow you to understand water. Yeah, from a chemical point of view, you have to know that, because in chemical reactions the molecule is dissociated, and it doesn't work. The idea of H2O, the unit of water, doesn't work when you're doing those kinds of of chemical procedures, but for the physical properties it is. So H and O are elements, and the idea of elements is that they're two different things and you put them together. Right? So the ancients used to say there are four elements: earth, fire, water and air, and there'll be different variations of that. And what they meant is pick anything, it'll have a certain amount of fire and air in it and so on. Right? So that's the idea of an element. But a unit is that you take this simple little thing and multiply it by a million, and that's what the larger phenomena is. Because there's a million of them, of course you'll have all sorts of things happening that you wouldn't find in a single one on its own. Right? But when you go from a molecule of water to an ocean, all you're doing is taking more molecules of water. So that's a unit. Okay, so the unit is a relationship between the whole and the part. The unit is the tiny bit of the whole. The gestalt is, and the unit. The idea of a gestalt is the complementary concept to a unit. Because when you understand that something is nothing but a whole lot of little things like this, you actually have the concept of it. Yeah? When you understand that water is just a lot of H2O molecules, you have a concept of water. Therefore, the water in that sense becomes for you a gestalt, just one whole thing, where you have a water cycle, where it evaporates, goes into clouds, comes back into the rain, and so on, goes round. You couldn't have that concept which made rain and snow and oceans and rivers as a whole unless you understood it was all H2O. It didn't matter whether you knew anything about hydrogen and oxygen, but you have to have the idea that there is a unit and they're all the same. And then you have a gestalt. Even if you thought they were all little sprites, it wouldn't matter, but you understand that they're all a little unit. So unit is a relationship between the whole and the part. Right? Unity is a relationship between different things. It's a relationship between elements. Right? So what do you need to have a good class? You need a teacher who knows what they're talking about, you need some material which is interesting, and you need some students. They're the elements of a good class, right? What are the units? Well, I suppose they're people, whatever. Doesn't matter. Okay, so they're very different concepts. Unity is just a way of saying the different elements combined in one. Yes, Gavin?
Yeah, this little guy here,
yep.
American Civil War
Union
uniform. Right?
Yeah. Not a tram conductor.
No.
He might be now, the Civil War's been over.
In his previous life he may well have been.
That's
but
right.
Right now in the war he is a sergeant because he's got 3 stripes.
Absolutely. Illustrating the idea of identity. Two different things in one. Yeah.
So it doesn't matter that the unity is made up of something that is in fact now latent, but it's still in there, and potentially may well come out to the fore again, and the other one becomes latent. Like was a soldier.
Yeah.
So it still keeps that dual identity, even though something is now to the fore and it might swap around and so on.
Yeah. And in understanding how an army works, it's really important to know that they're not just soldiers, they're also human beings, isn't it? So good understanding of the whole is understanding what your units are. They're human beings playing a role in this case. Okay, so I'm going to just skip forward to where we've got to do today. And they're the two things that I felt we needed to deal with before going on. Anyone else thought of something in the meantime? Problems we had last week? I mean, I know we've really skirted over the surface of some of these things. I think of how quickly we dealt with the idea of word meaning. And you can bash your head over the concept of word meaning for years before you really get a hold of what he's saying. But this is what we're doing. We're taking 10 hours to get a handle on all of them. So, Perezhivanie. This is the first thing we're dealing with. And along with Perezhivanie, the concept of catharsis. Catharsis is an old word. It comes from Greek drama, where a lot of fine words originate in Greek drama theory. And what it was the idea that by going along to watch a play with all sorts of drama and emotion going out, it was a way for you to release all those feelings, sort of vicariously through the characters. A catharsis was later used to refer to giving people something to make them vomit, to get all the stuff out of you. And then, of course, it was taken over in the talking cure by Freud and others, meaning to get you to sort of repeat your experience in order to work through it and process it. And that's the kind of meaning it has here. There's no great difference between the meaning that is attached to catharsis when it gets used in chat and what Freud talks about. Right? But generally speaking, chat people don't talk very much about catharsis, they just talk about Perezhivanie. Now, it's a great concept. It's a Russian word which is filled with all sorts of nuances that come from Russian life and literature, which you can never ever translate into English. Pere, P-E-R-E, is a root which sort of means carrying something over, a little bit like surviving, living over. So there's a certain element of survive in Perezhivanie. Right? And I think Zivan is to do with going through as well. Altogether it means an experience. But Russians don't have the words at and the. You know, Russians just say Perezhivanie. They don't say a Perezhivanie. The problem historically been is that since the term has come up in Russian literature, and it's Russians that talk about it, and a lot of people that have taught us about this concept don't speak very good English, they're inclined to leave out the up or the. Right? Now the odd thing is then people who speak English have picked that up and talk about Perezhivanie as if it was a substance. Right? Therefore you completely cannot grasp the meaning of Perezhivanie if you talk about Perezhivanie and not, for instance, the plural, Perezhivania, or a Perezhivanie. So, for example, in John Dewey's work, he has an article called Having an Experience. There's a capital A on the "and," and he explains that having an experience is different from having experience. You turn up to a job and you say, what experience you've got? I've done 10 years in this job and I learnt this and I went to these things and whatever. That's your experience, right? You could have slept through the whole thing, but it's still your experience, right? On the other hand, you know, you come in the evening and your partner says, God, what's happened to you? It's, oh, I've had an experience. And, you know, they're not asking for, you know, like your job qualifications. You've had an experience. And an experience, it's a discrete thing. It has a beginning and an end. And it stands out from the general background of things. Right? Now, the thesis is that the personality is actually formed through experiences. And since being required to reflect on this, I've reflected on my own life. I think it's probably too complicated to do a bit of self-analysis here. But there are certain experiences in my life, for example, cases where there are a couple of occasions in my life where I sort of took my heart in my hand and I went and did something that could have led to disaster, the sack and humiliation, but it worked. Completely transformed my social position, my identity, and changed my life in those occasions. Right? And they came down to seconds. I can't give you the whole bracket. I walk into a plant room and I tell the contractor, that's all wrong, pull it out. Right? Thereby the guy's profit margin is gone, disaster, but it worked. And that actually transformed our whole system within my employer's domain by taking that stand. I also spent 19 years overseas. That was an experience as well. Even though it was stretched over 19 years, the whole business of pulling myself up from the milieu and the country and the friends that I grew up with, landing myself as a foreigner in another part of the world, with no particular skills to sell either, and then coming back after that was an experience. Right? So, if you haven't already done it, I mean, think about your own life. Right? These experiences. And how does the character form? How does the personality form other than through surviving these experiences? Yes?
Is personality only formed by experiences? Is temperament involved?
Well, it is formed through experiences, but not created through experiences. Yeah? Now, there's a famous article called "The Problem of the Environment," where Vygotsky talks very briefly about Perezhivanie. It's lecture 2, and lecture 1 was the problem of heredity. And that's not the beginning and end of it. It's not saying that the experiences can account for the totality of a person, but that's what forms the person, right? But for temperament is a classic example. I mean, I tend to lean towards the fact that you're born with a temperament. But your parents also have a temperament. And they can either go together or they can clash. You know, if you've got parents with the same, like sanguine temperament that you've got, that'll be fine. But if you've got parents with a very, doleful kind of temperament, and you're just born with that get up and go and I wanted to know and yes, then that's going to lead to all sorts of conflict and experiences which will then form that. Okay? And there is heredity, and there is the gifts of nature, but the gifts of nature just don't make a personality. They have to work through experiences. Now, that's the sense in which Vygotsky famously says that Perezhivanie experiences are a unity of consciousness and the environment. Okay? And the example he gives, a woman who is a single parent and she's a drunk and she has 3 children. The younger child is just an infant and actually are not affected by having a drunken mother at all. It all goes right over the infant's head. Doesn't know anything about it, doesn't know anything different, doesn't recognise any dangers, anything unusual or anything, unaffected. The second child is absolutely traumatised by the mother's behaviour and suffers considerable psychological damage through it. The older child, who's a boy, is thrust into the responsibility to be the senior man in the house and makes an accelerated development in order to care for his mother and the younger children and cope. Doubtless a pathological development because it's accelerated, but a very different development. So in giving these examples, all Vygotsky is saying is that a situation isn't just a list of factors in the environment around you, like mother, age, drunken, unemployed, father, absent. It depends. The meaning of the factors in the environment is what they mean for you. That is to say, the lived experience of that depends on its significance for you. For example, depending on your own stage of development. But many things. Temperament, again, this is a classic example. Having a mother who had a very fiery temperament may mean nothing to you if it just happened to match your own temperament, right? Okay, so all he's saying when he says that Perezhivanie are unities of the consciousness and the environment it's not the environment as such, but its meaning for you. Now, I want to emphasise, this seems silly to have to say it, but Vygotsky has been criticised for saying, on the basis of, well, how can a child know what the meaning of something is? You're intellectualising it. So when I say the meaning of it, it means just the significance of it. Like, for instance, if a dog walks into the house, the cat runs for it, right? Or he might stand up and fight or whatever, like one of the videos I was just looking at this afternoon. But the dog has a certain significance for the cat because of danger. It doesn't, not intellectualising. The cat doesn't know anything about dogs really. It's not a thinking being in that sense, but it reacts. So that if I say the strange dog entering the house has a meaning for the cat, that's all I mean. It has a certain significance, a certain relation that depends not only on the thing itself, the objective fact, but the subject. What it means for the subject. You okay with that? That's all that unity means. You've got to look at the relationship between the two sides of the equation. Okay? So, yeah.
I feel like this is probably stupid, but Perezhivanie Perezhivanie is a unit of consciousness.
Yeah, it's a unit of consciousness, but
But it's also a unity of environment and consciousness.
yes. Yeah. Now, how can you make sense of that? Because you understand something as not as just a snapshot, right? But we understand things as a process. So you can only understand consciousness as a process if you understand it as the sort of the product of all those experiences. But it's not really right to just talk about a product there and the process there. Right? With the way Vygotsky talks, there's no distinction between the product and the process. So we can say consciousness, the Perezhivanie is a unit. I think a personality would be more right. It's translation issues there. The meaning of personality in English is not quite matched by an appropriate Russian word, but I think that would be more appropriate. When he says that, it means that your personality, as it is at an instant, is just a sum of all the things all the experiences you've gone through, right? Now, that is a relational thing. It's a relationship between you and the environment, both immediately and historically. Now, in the essay called The Problem of Age, which you've got on one of the links here somewhere, he criticises the policy of his colleagues, his Soviet colleagues who were investigating, conditions of children, and because they were just going about doing like a survey, like a tick box. Okay, this family, age of father, profession of father, income, age of mother, profession, how many siblings, what diseases. And they were trying to understand the problems of child development in their country by just listing out the factors. Right? And Vygotsky's criticising that. The Perezhivanie experiences aren't just things that happen to you. See this thing during the week of some guy who lost both his feet and his hands climbing mountains, got frostbite. What does he do? As soon as he's got some prosthetics back in, he's out climbing a mountain. I mean, that's not how I'd react to losing my hands and feet, right? So the idea that the personality is a manifestation of all those experiences, the discrete things that have happened to you, that you've gone through and survived. Right? Now, but Perezhivanie is a little bit more than that, because this is sort of relevant to all this stuff about post-traumatic stress disorder and things, and the way fashions have changed about how to deal with it. We all agree with catharsis now. We think it's a terrible thing if someone's been through some horrific experience of, digging through bodies to get out and climbing over their mother's, dissected body to escape from somebody. What they really have to do is really think about that a lot and bring it all out and tell everyone, how do you feel about this? That's the fashion today, right? But that's not the only idea about this. Some people perfectly well put it all behind them and got on with their life, right? But the idea of Perezhivanie is that you can have an experience, and it can be very traumatic, very exhilarating or whatever, but until you actually process it, however you process it, whether it's in a public way by putting on a big show and crying and saying how terrible it was, or just by quietly working over by yourself, whatever, however you process it, it's only when you actually process it that your personality makes the development. Right? So this is like a correction to the first idea, the first approximation, that it's the experiences that form the personality. Not quite. It's actually the experiences together with the processing of those experiences which then sort of consummate the development in the personality. Right? Because a lot of people will go through an experience and say, oh, that was fun, what are we doing tomorrow? Someone else will be profoundly affected by that, will stew over it for a long time before they can actually process it. And the word Perezhivanie includes, for the Russians, that whole process. It isn't, when they say it's like a living through, that means you actually work it over and you process it. And that's what Vygotsky would mean. So it isn't quite just what John Dewey said, an experience, but an experience together with the catharsis. Okay. Now, how can you translate that? You can't. My personal view is you can't translate that into English except by calling upon two words. And an experience is a word well known to English speakers. Once they've realised that an experience is different from experience, they think, oh yeah, so it is. Right? I know that word. And catharsis. If you had any interest in, things at all, you would have come across the idea of catharsis. Okay. And Perezhivanie combines both of them. Okay, so far?
Can I just, so Perezhivanie includes the catharsis?
Yeah. It is, when I say it's living through, that actually includes processing it. So it's not just lived experience, it's lived and processed experience.
Okay.
Yeah? And it's a word in the Russian language, we don't have it in English. Okay? So that's why when I write, I just use the Russian word, and then you have to explain what the Russian word means. Because if I just use, commonly it's translated as experiencing, but that's missing it. Oh yeah, a common phrase. The Perezhivanie means the unity of intellect and effect, and Judith referred to this. Okay. And sometimes when people are translating Perezhivanie, they call it an emotional experience. Now, all I'd say is we reflecting on things and being psychologists or philosophers can have intellect over here and effect over there. But that's an abstraction. Abstraction literally pulling something out from its context. All experiences affect intellect or cognition, also will, attention, all the different psychological functions which abstraction can grasp are combined in the notion of experiencing. So yes, we can say it's a unity of intellect and effect, but that isn't intellect put together with effect. It just means not yet abstracted. Right? Experiencing is the primary. The idea of intellect and effect is abstracted from experiencing. Right? Water is the primary thing, but then we can get down with our instruments and our microscopes and our chemical substances. There's hydrogen and oxygen in there. Right? You've got arms and legs, but a human being isn't a combination of arms and legs. You're a human being, and actually the arms and legs on their own are worthless. Okay? So the primary thing is the experiences. The intellect and effect is abstracted from them, and by saying it's a unity of intellect effect, they're just reminding you, don't just take this as an emotional thing, don't just take this as an intellectual thing. It is the primary thing. It's a whole human being going through a whole experience and processing the whole thing. From that, intellectual changes come, learning, changes in identity, changes in the formation of will. Going through Perezhivanie, a major route to developing the will.
So you can have an experience without having catharsis, but you can't have the catharsis without having the experience.
As far as I can see.
Yeah.
Except, you're bending the words, otherwise. You go along and watch a Greek play, then you can have your catharsis, can't you? But
that's still an experience.
Yeah, well, the idea is what has been cathartic is a vicarious experience. But you're right, the two go together, yes.
Is that similar to the distinction that Heidegger makes between erfahrung and awareness? Erfahrung is undergoing an experience, say with language, that you are changed as a result.
May well be. My knowledge of Heidegger is only superficial, I'm sorry. I developed a dislike of the guy. I know he's important and things, but I can't help you, I'm afraid.
I don't like him very much, but
he is important, but I've got my hands full understanding Vygotsky and his impact. Okay, let's just move on. Okay. Now, what I think I brought out about Perezhivanie is it's derived from a situation. Now, you may not have as definite a meaning of the word situation as I've settled upon, but a situation is like a definite conjunction of factors that's a thing in itself, right? So if I pick up the mobile phone and phone Mum and say, Mum, I've got a situation, yeah, that she's not expecting me to say, oh look, you know, there's a lovely field here and the cars are going by and, you know, there's two people in the car. She's expecting a situation, right? A problem, something that requires a response. So the idea of a situation, which is found in the idea of Perezhivanie, or an experience, that side of it, is very crucial to Vygotski's whole theory of child development. And in fact, Vygotsky died very young, and really only a few years after he really got on to his sort of main ideas, and not every avenue was sort of totally explored. But I really think there's not a great difference between what he had to say about Perezhivanie and his theory of child development. And as far as I can see, although there were arguments about this, at the moment everyone who knows seems to agree that Perezhivanie are things that little children, very little children, go through just as much as adults. In recent times, there's a fellow called Fyodor Vasilyak who wrote a book called Perezhivanie, translated, also the psychology of Perezhivanie, translated as psychology of experiencing, in 1984, and he's quite a leading figure in Moscow psychology today, except he's, well not except, I mean one mention, he's become very dedicated to Orthodox religion and less dedicated to Marxism these days, but c'est la vie in that part of the world. But he developed a whole theory of psychotherapy based on Perezhivanie, and it developed a certain there was a certain separation between people that were dedicated to Vygotsky, that saw it as part of child development, and others who said no, only an adult can go through a Perezhivanie. But after going up and down the hills for a while, I think I can now say it's agreed that people at all stages of development have Perezhivanie, but it's different. The way a child goes through a Perezhivanie, and the way an adult does is different. So, generally speaking, for a child to make a development, the predicament that they're in is just, it's two-sided. Let's leave Perezhivanie for a second. Let's talk about what Vygotsky calls a social situation of development. If a child is, say, an infant, the parents, the carers around them regard them as an infant. At a certain point in the child's development, they get sort of fed up with being an infant. There are things, needs, that they begin to perceive on the horizon of their world that they want. They begin to outgrow their role as the infant in the house. And then what happens is a crisis breaks out, and it can manifest in being very difficult, refusing to do what they're told, because one of the things of being an infant is that I'm not an expert on, I'm far from being an expert on child development, so you excuse me if I get things and age is a bit mixed up. But there's a certain level of development of a child where the mothers can operate them like a puppet, right? Like negative psychology. You're not allowed to have your dinner date. Yes, I am, right? You know, by telling the child that they can't do something makes them do it. The child becomes aware that they are being manipulated by their parents, and that they resent this at a certain age, and how can they escape being utterly controlled by their parents? Well, they go through a period of difficulty where they just refuse to do anything, right? So the thing is, at a certain point, what was all fine and all a child ever knew suddenly becomes a situation where they develop needs that only grew in that situation from being an infant, which can't any longer be met in the old way. And it isn't just them, it's all those around them. So that's a social situation of development, and it's the contradictions of that situation, the fact that their needs can't be met within those set of relationships, that it makes it a contradiction, makes it a situation, and forces them to develop. And what distinguishes just learning from development is that not just you that change, but you change the situation. So when I mentioned some times in my life where I said I took my heart in my hand and went for it, and actually succeeded, and then my whole, not only did my psychology sort of change on the subjective side, but I was treated quite differently by other people, right? Which then of course reinforced my change in personality. I was allowed to be a different person. Right? So again, it's a unity of two different things. The social situation of development is both the child and their needs, and the role that they're given by the carers around them. Right? And it's a situation because at a certain point they can't meet their needs. Right? You take a teenager who develop independence to a certain point, but they live in a certain suburb, they went to a certain school, they have a certain level of income, their parents write so-and-so, they have a certain dress style. In other words, they are the absolute incarnation of a certain social position. And the fact is, at a certain level, around about 13, 14 or 15 or something, young people want to be their own selves. So how the hell can they do that? They don't know anything else other than what they've been brought up in. And often the reaction is that their parents are wrong about everything. They do absolutely everything that they're not supposed to do, right? They start dressing in the opposite way that someone of their particular social class ought to. They take on beliefs that are the diametric opposite of what they've always believed. And in that way, they eventually, they go through that sort of period. It takes a day or it takes a decade. Somewhere they actually find a social position for themselves. Yes, Gavin.
What about the child then who, the one you gave earlier, experience where the child has to step up because of the drunk mother? They haven't actually lived that experience, and next thing they're having to make sure bills are paid or...
Yeah, well, the older child makes that development. They're aware of the situation, and they respond to it, and they take on a different role. Now, if all the neighbours and the man at the post office that has to cash the gold checks or whatever it is doesn't accept that, say, no, I'll get your mother to do that, you're too young, the whole thing will fail, won't it? But he'll put on a brave face, he'll take the mother's gold check and go down to the post office to change it, say, oh, Mum couldn't come today, could you cash it for me? And then, or whatever, he will act out that role as if he's the senior man, and if everyone around him goes along with that, which requires him to carry it off, you have to walk into the room as if you belong there, and you'll sail up to the counter like your parent would, not like a kid would looking at the sweets on the side, right? So he has to make that leap and act out the role, and if the people around him accept him in that role, then the development is underway. Yeah? So here we have a case of how Vygotsky conceives child development. One, it is a unity of the relationships or those around the child's environment, and the child themselves. Some children, for instance, maybe through a genetic defect, something they're born with, may never actually go into that stage, and may stop at a certain stage, simply because they don't develop those desires to break through and get to the next stage. On the other hand, they may have parents who are so determined to keep them as babies, absolutely block their efforts at independence, that they are forcibly kept down. Right? So it is a two-sided relationship thing that involves transformation by the person and transformation of those around them. Yeah? So I refer to this idea as a predicament. Yeah? And the predicament's an interesting word etymologically. Goes back to Greek rhetoric and so on. If someone accuses you, then they're predicating something to you, and predicating that is saying something about you got transformed into a predicament, which in certain times and places, predicament and accusation have the same meaning. The meanings have split off in different directions, but predicament is really like being accused, falsely accused. That's etymologically where it comes from. So there is a very important type of predicament, and that's being born with some abnormality in the sense that it's different from the norm of those around you, or acquiring one, not necessarily being born one. Now, in Vygotsky's day, the official administrative department that dealt with this kind of thing took all defects of any kind, whether you were deaf, lost both legs, or whatever it was, they're all gathered together under the heading of defect, right? And there's a science of studying these things called defectology. All this sounds terribly politically incorrect in today's environment, and sort of rightly so, but one has to understand that when you're reading Vygotsky, he's using the terminology that made sense in his time when he's talking about defects. But actually, when you read what Vygotsky says, he sees the defect as in the social environment, not in the individual. Right? So if, for example, you happen to be 8 foot tall, you become very well aware of the defect in the design of buildings that put the doorways to about 6'8". Right? Clearly a case where they didn't realise when they made this door that not everyone is under 6'8". Right? That may be the way a person who's 6'8" thinks. And this lecture theatre, I would imagine, will have an audio loop around the front seats here, because at a certain point the university realised that not everyone has perfect hearing, and so they put in an audio loop. Right? If the audio loop wasn't there, that would be a defect in the arrangements of this lecture theatre. There isn't a defect for a person who's deaf now, because they can sit in that front seat and they will know, because they will have checked it out when they registered as a student, and they have a little T thing in their hearing aid that picks up from the audio loop, and they hear perfectly well. So a defect is a relational thing again. It's not a defect in the person, it's in the defect in the relationship between the social environment and the person. And there's no really logical reason to place the defect in one side or the other. It's a political thing, whether you say, oh, look, you're dumb, it's your defect, pull your socks together, or you say, hey, your language is absolutely incomprehensible and speak clearly. Right? It's a toss-up. But it's undoubtedly a relational thing. And a lot of Vygotsky's work was done in dealing with defects. You learned a lot out of that. And I'm just reading this little bit at the bottom, that the defect, which is in the social relation, is resolved by the development of the psychological function of the individual and the adjustment of the environment to meet the needs of the individual. So what Vygotsky just found was that for every defect there's a compensation. And that compensation again will be partly internal and partly social in one or another measure. But that if someone can't see, then they develop other ways of managing the problems that we use for sight. And he called the defect compensation a unit of analysis. That in studying in the science which was called defectology at the time, the unit was the unity of the defect and the compensation for it, which again the compensation could be on one side or the other. The defect was a relationship one, and it was basically how a person meets their needs and makes a life under this condition of something being off normal, and that's what he took to be the unit of analysis. So it's a unity because there are two components, two elements to the problem of defectology. One is a shortfall in provision for someone that's off-centre, not middle of the bell curve, and the other thing is the compensation that the person makes in their own activity to get around the problem. Okay? And that idea was actually appropriated from Alfred Adler, who's the guy who invented, I believe, the phrase inferiority complex. But that's not all Alfred Adler did. There's so many Austrian Adlers, I could easily get them mixed up. I think that's right. Okay. Oops. Okay, so we're going to have just a few minutes to recap. Perezhivanie, Perezhivanie, and catharsis, social situation of development and disability compensation. Perezhivanie are units of analysis because they include, for the Russians, catharsis, but if we wanted to write it in English, we'd have to say experience and catharsis is a unit. Right? Because we can never understand the personality simply by looking at the experiences, even if we took account of the internal or psychological significance of what the person had been through. That in itself would not be enough as a unit to understand the development of the personality. We would have to take the catharsis into account. And for children, that's very much in how the adults around them reflect back to the child. Right? So look at this. This is lovely, isn't it? Yes. Do you like that? So carers, when they interact like that with a child, are reflecting the child's possible experiences back to the child, and therefore helping the child actually process what they're going through. Right? And so it becomes meaningful to them. And that needn't necessarily be one of these big sort of things that happens only half a dozen times in your life. It's actually a little thing. In fact, I pressed one of the Russians on depression. I read one of Gorky's book on his childhood. He wrote a whole series of books covering his whole life. And there's an incident he describes in his childhood. I said, Mikhail, this incident in Gorky, is that a Perezhivanie? He said, yes, that's a Perezhivanie. Yeah, great. And then he gave me a bit of a spiel what he thought about Gorky. But I said, isn't it the case that everything described in that novel is a Perezhivanie? He said, yeah, it would have to be, right? Because when you tell the story of your life, even though a lot of the things are very little, but he describes how he got onto a boat. So for a small child, getting onto a boat to go through one of these great rivers, it's an experience. He describes the people he saw there. All these things which are stuck in his mind 50 years later, or whatever it was, they're experiences which he's processed and he remembers them. He remembers them as discrete things. He doesn't remember the colour of the fence on the third house from the left. Right? It was an experience. Sorry, he experienced it, but it wasn't an experience. It didn't stand out from the general background. But those things that stand out from the general background and you actually process, then that's actually what makes up your autobiography. So that's a very generous definition of Perezhivanie. Yeah.
How would false memory then be integrated into that sort of theory when you have something really traumatic happen and you make yourself remember it differently?
This is where you really need to speak to a psychologist and not a whole philosopher like me, but personally I'm ultra sceptical of the whole false memory thing. I think I have my prejudice is that it's a construction of the psychologist more than it's a product of the child, but I'm not a psychologist, I'm an amateur.
But philosophically, if you were to be asking children about their Perezhivanie as experiences, there are multiple truths and multiple ways in which people experience different things. Isn't there already something conceptual that makes meaning?
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from now. Yeah. It's the sign at the moment for that discussion is lived experience. Okay, I may think that was not a big deal, but clearly you're traumatised by it, and therefore that's what matters. Your lived experience was traumatic, even though I happen to know the person involved meant you no harm or whatever, and it was actually you weren't in any danger, but your lived experience was that. Yes, that's right. If we're not talking about false memories, if we're talking about memories that have a certain colour for the person, that that's what it meant to them, even if there was little objective basis for that opinion, that's the lived experience. Yes, that's right. Is that
yeah, and that's all that really matters, isn't it? As far as development goes.
Up to a point. But
it becomes subjective.
It's not all that matters, but let's suppose it's a father-daughter thing, and the daughter has developed an idea that their father wanted to sleep with them, right? And let's just suppose, as a therapist, you can absolutely establish with complete certainty that there was no such intention. That's significant, isn't it? Because there's a relationship which will be forever broken, but if for example, you know there's a basis for re-establishing a relationship, that there was misunderstandings that went on there, whatever, and you could repair that relationship, that would be much better for all concerned than say all that matters is she thought the father was out to have sex with her, and that's all that matters. If your investigations were indecisive, you couldn't tell, and that's probably mostly the case, or if then your investigation had plausibility to that impression, that's different. Okay, but there is also an objectivity, right? And that's something that's worth knowing about. That it isn't all just in the mind of the person. Yeah? Because let's suppose, something that really annoys me is someone who's just become, for example, the best tennis player in the world, right? And I'm not saying that Djokovic said this, but this is a typical kind of thing. They've defeated every absolutely obsessive tennis player in the world. Hundreds and hundreds of people that wanted nothing better in the world than to be themselves the best tennis player in the world. And this particular person defeated every one of them. And they say, all that matters is you can be whatever you want to be. I'm very proud to win this trophy, but any one of you can do it as well. What a load of nonsense. Yeah? There's only one, trophy going for the Australian Open. Now, I understand what they're saying, raise your sights, believe in yourself, this is good. But there is also an objective truth. What you achieve depends on things that are outside your control as well. And it's a bloody good idea to get to realise that, right? Because it isn't just about getting to be best in the world. It's about being comfortable with yourself, And this sort of insanity about anyone can achieve anything is just a formula for making people feel terrible, because 99.9999% of people won't get there. Yeah? So I'm just sticking up for objective truth as well as lived experience there. Okay. Social situation of development. So in child development there'll be a series of these, discrete series of situations, each of which have a name. So you have infancy, early childhood, preschool. They're different in different cultures. They're not the same number of months or years for every child, but there's certain roles which are given society offers to children, and you have to sort of fit into one of those roles. You have to, because you can only, when you go to school, you get slotted into different groups, and that's where you go. You don't get choice about that. You're not allowed to go to school before a certain age, and so on, right? So there are certain roles offered to you, and there's situations of development come not in a continuous stream. They come in a stepwise fashion. And you may break the mould and develop separately, that's fantastic, but even then, that's just the exception that proves the rule. Generally speaking, you have to go through a series of steps. Each one of them presents certain problems. Like if you want to be independent, you have to earn a certain amount of money, get your driver's license and so on, and it will require certain challenges to be overcome to get to be that role of an independent person as a young person, and so on and so forth. Okay?